Hello, Alethea back here again. We're looking at the case study about the Tylenol poisonings and how Johnson & Johnson helped to deal with the crisis and address the public and answer some questions about it. So it was a really interesting case to read because I knew that there was reasoning for all the safety seals and all the extra stuff you have to go through when you're trying to take an over-the-counter medication. I never really understood exactly what had happened, so it was really kind of cool to see why these precautions were taken and how a big company like Johnson & Johnson, who makes practically everything you use in your house, dealt with it, and how they use some of the project management techniques or just management techniques in general to address this kind of situation and be real about it instead of being very mechanical. They are managers. So there are a few questions. So I would like to just go through the questions, give you my answers and my take on it. So first question, it says, when a crisis project occurs, who should be the leader of the crisis team? So I said in a basic question, it depends on the severity of the crisis. The term crisis implies a catastrophic event, but to whom? To the company, customer, consumers, or stakeholders. Who is it a crisis for? The level of impact will affect the one who will be taking leadership of the crisis. So in the case of Johnson & Johnson, it's a giant crisis because product that they put out there on the shelf that people use, now people are dying, and that is scary as hell. So, but I really said I like how the CEO, James Burke, took it upon himself to be the spokesperson of the crisis. And this came from the case study in the book. It says that Burke knew that the McNeil division, which manufactured Tylenol, might not be able to battle the crisis alone. And that comes from a page within the case study, an actual quote from there. And I think it was interesting because he said, well, they probably have never managed a crisis, or they've never been on TV, or they're not sure what to do, so I'll step in. I'm sure that he used them as consulting and got all the answers from them, but he was the face. And I think that was a great leadership quality that he had right there. Question 2. Will there be a crisis committee or a crisis project sponsor? So I said this goes along with the first question, whom is the crisis affecting the most? With this answer, you can better answer the question. So the first question I said is the crisis or catastrophic event to the company, the customer, the consumers, the stakeholders. Who is it more of a crisis for? Now, I think in the case of the Tylenol poisonings, it was obviously a crisis for the consumers, obviously a crisis for the company. I think later Burke says the stakeholders they weren't concerned with the stakeholders, so I think it was a crisis for everybody overall, but for the stakeholders just thinking about purely their impact to the company, it wasn't really a crisis for them. So the second half of answering question 2, I said Johnson & Johnson had a crisis committee and the executive suite behind managing the crisis. Everyone pulled together to do what they could do to help. So the way I kind of took it and what they said was that everybody just kind of came together and said, I'll take this, and I'll take this, and I'll take this, and just started taking pieces without being assigned. I think one of the things they said in there was that they were all in their crisis meeting and they just all kind of looked at each other and just knew immediately what to do. So it's a really tight-knit team. They've worked together a while and they just knew what had to be done without even speaking it. And that's a pretty amazing kind of team to have. So let's look at question 3. How important is effective communication during a crisis? Well, I put this as a must with an exclamation mark. I mean, I kind of think it's a no-brainer question, but let's go further. I said Burke, the CEO, was an open book. He was not afraid to tell anyone everything that he knew or probably didn't know. And he was okay with saying, I don't know, let me find out. It seemed like he and his team were in sync and could communicate easily and effectively. This kind of goes along with different things that I have heard from some of my job experiences. I know it's probably not part of this, but my current boss says that I'm not afraid to tell people I don't know. I'll go find out. While other people in my job roles are very much, well, I don't know, and I'm not going to let anybody know that I don't know, which I think is incorrect. So let's go to question 4. How important is stakeholder relations management during the crisis? So again, this goes along with the first 2 questions. Who is affected most by this crisis? The company, the customer, the consumers, or the stakeholders? So in this case, it was very, very important, because had Johnson & Johnson decided, well, no one's told us, no one's communicated, so whatever, or just went on and made a blank statement like, this is a big crisis, I'm sorry people died. I mean, there's no emotion. It's just kind of like, well, I'm supposed to give a response, so I'm gonna. And thankfully they went the opposite of that, which fared very well for Johnson & Johnson. Let's go to question 5. Should a company immediately assume responsibility for a crisis? I said no. According to this case study, Johnson & Johnson didn't assume responsibility. That is written in the case study. But they took action to correct the problem and to make sure to pull all products from the shelves. They also expressed sympathy to the families affected. So they decided to not take the blame, but to fix the problem now, make sure it wasn't going to continue. So question 6. How important is response time when a crisis occurs? This is crucial. So you can think about how big the crisis is. I mean, obviously if it's a crisis, it's pretty huge, so you need to react right away. But if it's a bigger crisis like this one, people dying, that is gigantic. I mean, immediate action needs to happen. So I said, you must respond as soon as you know a crisis has occurred. Johnson & Johnson didn't know immediately, but responded as soon as the bad news was heard. So here's another quote from the case study. On the morning of September 30th, 1982, reporters began calling the headquarters of Johnson & Johnson asking about information on Tylenol and Johnson & Johnson's reaction to the deaths. This was the first that Johnson & Johnson heard about the deaths and the possible link to Tylenol. So I said Johnson & Johnson reacted quickly, and rightfully so. This kind of crisis needed to be dealt with to ensure the problem was stopped. Then you can take a bit of time to have a solution now that the product was pulled from the shelf, which I think was very smart. All the product was pulled. They found out that there were certain lot numbers or certain product containment, or I guess lots probably a good one. And they went and made sure all those lots, found out where they were shipped, pulled all of that. So whether, even if it was in the same area, they just pulled it because they didn't want to risk anybody else dying from this. And then once it was pulled, they told everybody who had bought lot numbers from that specific area, said, hey, take it back to the store, we'll exchange it for a product that's not part of that lot number. So take care of those customers and make sure anybody who had purchased it was not going to consume it. And then they decided, okay, what do we do now? How do we keep this from happening? And I think after the first time, it was kind of like, well, this was an isolated incident after they had investigated and felt confident that it wasn't their tactics, so they didn't go on. But then after it happened again 2 years later, they realized, yeah, this is something we need to prevent. It's probably going to happen again if somebody did it, so the same person is doing it somewhere else. Number 7. How important is it to show compassion for people that have been injured? So this is the best way to be a human. We're all humans and things happen out of our control, but it's your control of how you're going to react to the issue or the situation. So I quoted here, but when the going gets tough, the corporation gets human, and that makes it something special in the bloodless business world. So that was one of the reporters that had made a comment about Johnson & Johnson. I said being kind and having or showing empathy is the best thing to do, to show the rest of the world how much this impacts you, the corporation. So I think there was a part where Burke was talking to press or giving a statement or something, and he actually was tearing up about how it affected these people and how they had died, and now these people's families is not going to have them around. And you could tell he was welling up at something that he had no control over with, but it was a product that he had. And that shows human side. I mean, even the crisis, they dealt with it, they did what they had to do, but then they showed a lot of empathy and a lot of sympathy for these people. I think more so empathy because they probably imagined, what if this was my family member that this has happened to? And I think that that's really important in any kind of crisis. Now, not every kind of crisis is going to have this kind of impact. I personally never dealt with a crisis like this. I really hope I never have to deal with a crisis like this. I hope that any crisis I have is just, we're going to make too much of this product, or too much of this product is going to be wrong, we need to stop the presses, so to speak, before it gets made. And I really hope I never have to be in this kind of situation, but I think they reacted very well and very human-like. So number 8, how important is it to maintain a paperwork trail? So this question, the next question, I don't really think were addressed in the case study, but I can kind of speculate, maybe think of what they could have done, maybe what I would have done or what I've seen done before. So as far as a paper trail, I said can we use a higher percentage than 100 here? A paper trail is very important, and with that paper trail, it seemed to help when the same crisis happened again. So Johnson & Johnson had a paper trail because they knew this had happened before, plus all the same people probably worked there, and they're like, oh God, this is happening again, what do we do? So I said there's no mention of paperwork with these two crises, but I can imagine there were mountains of paperwork, and it's probably still stored somewhere. So paperwork in this kind of thing is like lessons learned, is any kind of change, paperwork is a must. Now, this was a small project, and I understand this because this was a crisis that had happened. It wasn't something they had planned, and all of a sudden, oh, we have this crisis, which is also a project because it was a short-term endeavor, and then they fixed it. So this question 8 kind of goes with question 9. How important is it to capture lessons learned? So capturing lessons learned are always an important step. This allows you and your team to look at previous crises to show how effective that team was and to take notes on how to deal with your current crisis. Now, if you're going to have this mountains of paperwork and then a crisis happens, you may not have time to actually go back and look at that paperwork. However, if you're starting on an endeavor, you can look at things that did happen like a crisis and say, okay, how can we prevent that from happening again? Obviously, there are going to be lessons learned. There's more than likely going to be some people that were on the first project or the first crisis that are on this next project. So you can kind of work with them and say, okay, what happened? What did we do? And then you can go to them immediately as a subject matter expert and say, okay, what happened? What did you do? What happened with the team? What was the best way? That kind of thing. The second part of my answer says, this goes along with the last question. We don't know how these were captured with Johnson & Johnson, the lessons learned. But I'm sure there are mountains stored of it, and I bet they're probably digitized by now. And I can also imagine this is something that is talked about when you onboard new employees. So if somebody doesn't know or is unaware of it, they're probably like, hey, so this is why this happens. This is why we went from a bottle that you could just twist off to a bottle that is childproof, to a bottle that is triple sealed, to a bottle that's this, that, or the other, or this is the difference. And you know, a lot of times when you start with a company, you see where they started in different times and why they're at the point where they are now. So I work for a healthcare organization, so you go from not having a lot of protection when you're operating on someone to having these super sterile operating rooms with all this high-tech stuff, right? So you go from having to do everything manual and maybe not covering everything up, being exposed to some of the diseases of the blood, to not. So you kind of see all the different things and the kind of facilities you were in 100 and some years ago to the kind of facilities you're in now. So this kind of goes along with the same type of thing. There's a lot of lessons learned. There's a lot of things you can take away and improve upon. So that's really all I have for the questions. So I think that this was a really cool thing to learn. I mean, I've been taking Tylenol, I don't know, since probably before I can remember, I'm sure, when my mom had to give me some Tylenol. So I think this was a really interesting thing to learn because you always knew that they had all these seals and all these protections and all this extra stuff that you had to go through to get your Tylenol, and you never really understood it. I know that I was around for the whole pseudoephedrine thing where they were taking that and turning that into methamphetamines, and why you have to go and get it from the pharmacy rather than just taking it off the shelf. But I never really understood the Tylenol piece and why now a lot of other companies are following suit with their triple seals and all their extra protection and all that stuff. So I think it was a really cool case study to read, and I hope that you enjoyed my ramblings and my answers here. All right, thank you very much.